Hi class, it's Mr. McGregor and
Mr. S.
Monotone Rest. Anyway, in this video we'll be discussing not only how plants use sugars, which we have talked about in previous videos, but we'll be explaining how photosynthesis is involved with that process.
So photosynthetic organisms, or living things that can make their own food using sunlight, vary in the way they look. Some are made of many cells and mostly live on land, like plants. An example shown here is a tree that is a type of plant. While other photosynthetic organisms may only be made of a single cell, or a unicellular organism, and they might live in water, such as this algae.
Anything that can make its own food molecules by taking inorganic matter and turning it into organic matter is termed an autotroph. Organisms that can do photosynthesis are therefore autotrophs. Another type of autotroph, not listed here, are organisms that can use chemicals to make their food. These are called chemosynthetic organisms. The chemo in chemosynthetic refers to chemicals. The photo in photosynthesis refers to photons, or light.
The organic molecules that are being referred to here, that the plants are making and the algae are making, are sugars. The inorganic matter that the plants and algae are taking in to construct these sugars are CO2, carbon dioxide, and H2O, water. And once again, all autotrophs can build inorganic matter into organic matter. But the kind of autotroph that uses energy from sunlight to do this are called photosynthetic autotrophs. And just a quick note, oxygen is actually just a byproduct of photosynthesis. It's not actually what was supposed to be made. And that's kind of what byproduct means. It means that the process of photosynthesis and the plant's real goal is to make sugars in order to trap sunlight. Oxygen is just kind of the garbage left over. That's what byproduct means. So it's interesting that oxygen is so important for us, but truly oxygen is just kind of the junk that's left over, and we've evolved to make it really important to our everyday life.
So once again, photosynthetic organisms like plants and algae are one type of autotroph. The other type of autotroph, chemosynthetic organisms that we had been talking about, are rare to find on the surface of the earth. Chemical reactions are a process that will convert some molecules into other molecules. Therefore, photosynthesis is a type of chemical reaction. There are two parts to a chemical reaction. This is a chemical equation, which is a way to write out what happens in a chemical reaction. The first part of the chemical reaction are the interactions between the reactants. Right here. These are the ingredients in a chemical reaction.
In photosynthesis, the reactants are CO2 and H2O, carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide is made of two oxygen molecules and one carbon molecule bonded together, while water is made of two hydrogen molecules and one oxygen bonded together. The second part of a chemical reaction is the result of the chemical reaction. So when the reactants come together and a chemical reaction occurs, what comes out, the new substance that is formed from those reactants, are called the products. The products of photosynthesis are sugar and oxygen. The sugar, more specifically called glucose, is made of 6 carbon atoms, right there, bonded to 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygens. And these are all bonded to one another to make sugar, or glucose. And this is what the molecule looks like. And oxygen is just two oxygen atoms bonded together with a double bond. Glucose is that sugar that you're very familiar with, and it is a solid, while this oxygen is actually a type of gas. And this is the form oxygen is in when we talk about breathing in oxygen. It's actually breathing in two oxygen atoms to make a gaseous oxygen molecule.
How the reactants become products is actually not that complex. Imagine all the atoms being freed from their bonds like pearls from a broken pearl necklace. The atoms are totally separate for a quick moment, and then the free atoms are built into the new molecules, the products.
But I just want you guys to realize that when the sugar and oxygen are made, the CO2 and H2O are broken down and therefore don't exist anymore. They are the sugar and oxygen molecules, or they are actually inside. But regardless, they are no more. They have been converted into the products. This might be initially strange to some of you, not necessarily the chemical reaction, but how the atoms are actually being constructed to make the new molecules. Since if you were to add up both sides, the atoms on both sides of the chemical equation don't necessarily add up. For example, you'll notice there are 3 red atoms on the product side. The red atoms are supposed to be indicating oxygen. And there are 8 oxygens on the product side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So why don't you go ahead and do the rest? So you're figuring out how many hydrogens there are and carbons there are on the reactant side, and how many hydrogens and carbons there are on the product side. Hopefully these are the answers you came up with, and hopefully you are having the question, how did one carbon atom on this side of the chemical reaction become 6 over here? How did 2 hydrogens become 12? How did 3 oxygens become 8? I mean, aren't atoms made in the sun? They're not made when chemical reactions occur. So how is this possible? That's because the chemical equation actually looks more like this, where on this side of the chemical reaction you're going to have 6 carbon dioxide molecules combined with 6 water molecules. And when those 6 combine, 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water molecules, when they combine, they will make the sugar and the oxygen. And all the atoms should be accounted for. But let's just show you how this is done before you try it yourselves. So first of all, let's just look at this CO2 molecule and the 6 of them. So how many atoms are actually in there? Now I guess you could actually just count each of these and count how many black ones, which is the carbon, and how many red ones, which are the oxygen. But if you know a little something about math, which I know you guys have gone over this, you can actually distribute this to figure out how many atoms are present. So how many atoms are in this CO2? Well, you distribute the 6, so that would be 6 carbons, and you distribute it to that O2, that would make 12 oxygens. So we have 6 here, we got 12 here, and then you would add that to whatever you get from having 6 water molecules. So go ahead and try to figure that out yourselves. And let's see how much you get there. Well, hopefully you figured this out, and what we should have here is, since this would be 12, so 12 hydrogens, and distribute the 6 to the oxygen, that'd be 6 oxygens, so you would add the 12 and the 6, so that'd be 18 oxygens. We have 12 hydrogens here, and 6 carbons. Since we've showed you how to do this, why don't you now try the other side of the chemical reaction and figure out how many oxygens, how many hydrogens, and how many carbons are present. So there you go, there are the official totals. Hopefully these were your answers, and you should notice that there are an equal amount of atoms on both sides of the equation now. On the reactants there are 18 oxygens, and then on the products there's 18 oxygens. In the hydrogens there's 12, and 12 on the product side, and then carbons on the reactant side there's 6, and on the product side there are 6. So we have the same amount of atoms on both sides. And this is called a balanced chemical equation, which shows the law of the conservation of matter. And the law of conservation of matter demands that the number of atoms on one side of the chemical equation, the reactants, is equal to the other side of the chemical equation, the products. Because of course atoms just don't pop out of nowhere. If you're going to have a certain amount of atoms on the product side, you needed to have started with that same amount of atoms on the reactant side.
Kind of a sweet trick, right? Photosynthetic organisms take carbon dioxide, water, and make sugar. And since we are teaching you guys to be budding scientists, a question that a scientific mind must ask is, why even bother doing photosynthesis? Why does the tree want to bother making glucose at all? Well, because plants do a lot with the carbohydrates they make during photosynthesis. Here are just a few examples of what plants can do with their sugars. Fruit. This potato here is a carbohydrate. The syrup, and here is again the molecule of glucose that we keep referring to. But arguably, the most important thing that they could do with sugars is to store energy. Remember how sunlight powered the process of photosynthesis? Turns out that the real reason plants bother to make sugars in the first place is to capture and store the sun's energy. This is the energy that plants use to power their bodies. This is not dissimilar from the way batteries are used to store energy. Plants create sugars to store that energy to power their bodies. Essentially, that means that plants are solar powered.
Something else you might be asking yourself is, where is the sun's energy stored within these sugar molecules? Well, the energy from the sun is actually stored in between the atoms themselves in the bonds that have formed between the atoms. So the bonds are the things sticking the atoms together. And going further, if all the energy from the sun is in the bonds, Then to free the energy that was stored between the bonds, you need to break the bonds. When the bonds are broken, the energy that was taken from the sun's energy is released.
Where does all this sugar making actually happen, though? You wouldn't be wrong if you said it happens in an autotroph, which again, remember this word, auto, self, troph, food. And you would be more right if you said in an autotroph cells. But you would be even more right if you said inside the cell. So here are the chloroplasts. This is the organelle that is responsible for carrying out photosynthesis or sugar and oxygen production. So here is a close-up of a chloroplast. And actually a chloroplast is kind of like a little cell in and of itself. It's got this membrane on the outside. It's actually two membranes. And it has these little discs called thylakoids, a stack of them. It's kind of like looks like a stack of pancakes. That's called a grana. And then it has its own version, kind of like cytoplasm. It's a liquid on the inside of this thing called the stroma. The reason that these organelles appear green, and if we look at plants under microscopes, a lot of the times we'll see the cells look green, is because these thylakoids are coated in a type of pigment that is green. And when we talk about color a little bit more, we'll get into a little more detail about why that is. The name of the pigment that covers these thylakoids, or is in the thylakoids, is called chlorophyll.
It's helpful to compare some things that you might be a little more familiar with to other things that you are not familiar with, such as chloroplasts to, let's say, solar panels on houses. How are solar panels on houses similar to the chloroplasts in plants, and how are they different? Well, let's refer to this comparison chart. Both solar panels and chloroplasts both are absorbing the sun's light and converting it into energy that can be used to power, in the case of a house, and power appliances, let's say. But in the case of the chloroplasts, it's to power the actual plant that the chloroplasts are contained in. But they're different in the fact that in chloroplasts, the sun's energy is trapped in the bonds of a sugar molecule, whereas a solar panel is trapping that sun's energy and converting it into electricity. Once again, the energy in the chloroplasts will be used to power the organism, where the energy in the solar panels are used to power the household appliances. But going back to that original question posed earlier, why do photosynthesis at all? Beyond storing the sun's energy, what else does the plant do with the sugars made from photosynthesis? Well, the plants actually build their bodies with the sugars. So you can see here, this graphic is supposed to be showing you that you can take those sugars and make a leaf from it. You can take those sugars and make a potato or maybe a fruit, and you can take those exact same sugars and make something very structurally sound like this rope.
So this is how the sugars made in photosynthesis can be used to create a photosynthetic organism's body. So the plant will take one molecule of glucose right here, okay, and another molecule of glucose, and literally combine them together. The glucose molecules can be connected together, and if you remember from previous lessons, when two monosaccharides are combined, it forms a disaccharide. So this is a two-sugar compound called a disaccharide. And of course, this is just one example. They can also take glucose molecules and make very long chains, as we talked about, called polysaccharides. Okay? To make it easy on ourselves when naming sugar chains any longer than two sugars, so a disaccharide, di meaning two, so anything longer than that, we call them polysaccharides. So here's one with 3 sugars. And there's 4 sugars. Again, this is still a polysaccharide. We're just going to keep adding them. 5 sugars. 6 sugars. Get the idea? So these are still polysaccharides, but we can just keep combining the sugars. And when I say we, I mean plants, obviously. And before you know it, look at this. I don't even know how many sugars are here. I suppose I could count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. Still a polysaccharide. All right, so glucose can be connected to make tough polysaccharide that plants use to make their bodies with. And again, when we were talking about the weight of a plant coming from the air, here's all those carbon molecules that are formed during photosynthesis. These are all giving the plant its weight.
Yeah, so as crazy as it might sound, this wicker basket here, the wicker, is nothing but sugar. But so is probably the clothes on your back. If it's made of cotton, once again, that's nothing but sugar. Even this rope, if it's made out of hemp, if it's natural, then this rope is made out of many long chains of sugar that were made by the plant during photosynthesis. This type of tough sugar, made of these long chains of glucose, is called cellulose. Trees make their bodies from the polysaccharide molecule cellulose, and it is a type of polysaccharide sugar. But there is no point in trying to eat these sugars. First of all, they would not taste sweet at all, and they're actually way too tough for our digestive system to break down. So although it is made out of glucose, and glucose can be a molecule that animals use to power their bodies, in this form, the polysaccharide cellulose, although being, once again, a carbohydrate or a sugar, is in a form where animals cannot actually get energy from these molecules. They can't use them as food. So to summarize, think of it kind of like this. Here's a glucose molecule, this monosaccharide is going to be signified by this Lego, and we're going to connect a bunch of these monosaccharides together, a bunch of these Legos together to make this polysaccharide cellulose. And if you take a bunch of those towers of monosaccharides and connect them in a specific way, a bunch of this cellulose, you weave that in a certain way, they'll all combine to make parts of trees.
So let's just take a step back for a second to review. Plants use the sun's energy to take CO2 and H2O to construct glucose. So here's H2O, CO2, and here's the glucose molecule. And then those glucose molecules can be connected together to make their body. So knowing what you know, again, here's another question a scientific mind might ask. What would happen to the amount of H2O and CO2 in an environment if there is a growing tree in that environment? Hopefully this is what you thought. Decreasing amounts of H2O and CO2 in the environment would occur as the tree grows. That makes sense, right? Because as the tree is taking in the CO2 and H2O to make its body, it would be taking it out of the environment around it, out of the air. This is similar to how you would have less and less Lego blocks around if you constructed a larger and larger Lego tower. So what would happen to the CO2 levels in the atmosphere if trees continue to grow? The CO2 level would decrease. So pay attention to these molecules here as we go along in this story. The trees are growing and there is less CO2 in the atmosphere. The larger that trees get, the more CO2 and H2O they take in. And so that gets stored in the tree. Right? So it depletes it from the environment and stores it in the plant's tissues. That's why scientists call trees a sink for carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Sink was in air quotes. You couldn't see it because you're listening. Because it's not actually a sink. Like, it's saying that it's like it goes down the drain, but the drain is the tree. Whatever.
Going further still, so beyond making their bodies and creating molecules to store the sun's energy, what else can plants use those sugars they make during photosynthesis for? Well, they can put it in fruit. Plants know that animals love sugar as well, so they have created these things called fruits to trick animals into doing their biddings. They use animals to spread their seeds, which are their babies. A seed is essentially a plant baby that has not reached maturity yet. And so plants create fruits so animals will spread their seeds. And here you go. Here's a example of how that would work. So this horse, its intention for eating the fruit is not to be spreading the seeds or the plant babies, but to get some energy so it can continue living. And the horse will do its best to absorb as much of the nutrients and sugars from that fruit as it can. But the digestive systems, including ours, are not 100%. So they usually have some type of leftovers, let's say, from eating the food. And we call that poop. And that poop is pooped out, and that it would be the parts that were not absorbed, which includes the seeds. Well, that poop, which is all the food that was not absorbed by the horse, acts as fertilizer for the seed. So the seed will actually use the nutrients in the poop to grow. And this allows the tree to not necessarily compete with its baby, because hopefully the horse has eaten the fruit and kind of, galloped away and took a poop further away from the parent tree. So now the parent tree, where normally the seed would just fall from the tree, and now maybe the parent seed or the parent tree is kind of shading out its baby. Now the seed is far away in a pile of manure, which is nutrients, and the seed can grow into a strong new tree. So essentially the tree has tricked the animal into spreading the tree's babies, aka the seeds, but this wasn't that bad of a deal for the animal either, because it got sugars out of the transaction. So hopefully that boggled your mind a little bit, that the real reason why plants make fruits is not to feed you, but so you can spread their seeds. So I hope this video has helped explain why the sugars are made in photosynthesis and how they are so useful to the plant, and also how the process of photosynthesis occurs in greater detail. Hopefully you understand it better.
So I hope this video has helped you to understand the process of plants using photosynthesis to create sugar and make their bodies, store energy. Wait, you just said all that.